Fred VanVleet is a Houston Rocket in what is the craziest move of the NBA offseason so far. 3 years, $130 million, over $40 million a year for a player in Fred VanVleet that, yes, is a former All-Star, but also shot 39% from the field last year. His field goal percentage last season is less than what his annual salary is going to be over all 3 years of this deal. This is out of control. This is insane. We have to talk about this. Now, first and foremost, this is an overpay. I think even if you gave the Houston Rockets front office truth serum and asked them, is this too much for Fred VanVleet? Even they would say yes. Like, you can like him as a player. You can say, oh, he's going to do all these really cool things for our offense, help out our young players. We're going to get to all that stuff. But it has to be established in the very beginning, first and foremost, this is too much money for Fred VanVleet. He's not worth this much. This is like top 10, top 15 player in the entirety of the NBA money for Fred VanVleet. And yes, he's a former All-Star. And so maybe you could say he's a top 30, top 35 player, but he's not a perennial All-NBA guy. And these kinds of salaries typically are reserved for those kinds of players. Having said that, I don't hate the move for Houston. Now, obviously, like I said, on an annual basis, year by year, it is too much money. But this is what it was going to take to get VanVleet to leave a place that he's become very comfortable, where he built the entirety of his NBA career there in Toronto. It was going to take a massive amount of money for Houston to get him out of there. And it's not like Houston was doing much with this money anyway. They had all this salary cap space to spend this offseason, and they don't really have a ton of impending, extensions that are going to come up while VanVleet is on this deal, assuming that he stays in Houston for the entirety of the contract. It's not like, oh no, now we have to think about what it's going to look like to re-sign Jalen Green and Jabari Smith. Like, those guys' new extensions will kick in after, or I guess in Green's case, in the final year of VanVleet's contract. So yes, it's too much money, but it's money that they kind of had to spend, and clearly they prioritized this signing over bringing in someone like James Harden. And it's just one of those things where, yes, it's an overpay, and for other teams around the league, it'd be like, wow, like this is what we're doing? We're spending this much money on VanVleet. But in Houston's situation specifically, it's kind of not an overpay, just because they had to spend the money anyway. And in terms of the player to team fit, I also kind of like it. Like, more than anything else, what this Houston team needed, amongst a lot of different needs, but if you're really thinking about the development of the young players, how are we going to push this group forward? They needed a bit of an organizer. They need Jalen Green to just go and do cool scoring stuff and not really worry too much about getting everybody else involved and setting up the offense. You want to play towards his strength, which is a dynamic, athletic scorer, the guy that can get to the rim. He's a scorer at heart. He's not a facilitator. He's not a playmaker. He's much more of a scorer at heart. And no disrespect to Kevin Porter Jr., but like, we don't really need him out there running the point guard. Someone like VanVleet that is going to set other guys up, that can space the floor, that can play alongside a variety of different guards. You can prioritize Jalen Green in the offense on the ball still, and then, VanVleet can just be the guy that gets everybody organized and gets everybody set up. That is incredibly, incredibly valuable for a young team, not to mention what it's going to do for someone like Jabari Smith, as well as some of these other younger guys that they've got coming in. I think this is a really good signing for them from a basketball perspective, and it's certainly better than bringing in James Harden. Now, he wasn't as efficient as you'd like him to be last season. Certainly when you look at the shooting percentages, bit of a down year for him, dealing with some injury stuff. The Toronto situation was like sneaky weird over the last few seasons, but he brings championship pedigree to Houston. It's not a 4-year contract, which I think is really, really critical here. 3 years, I would have rather it been 2, but 3 is kind of, still okay, even on this massive of a number, because for Houston, again, they weren't really going to be using that money on anyone else anyway. But what about Toronto? Everybody's focusing on Houston, what it means for the Rockets, this massive move that they make now as they try and actually be a good basketball team for the first time in a couple of seasons. Toronto is now in a very weird situation. They are basically going to be counting on a pretty significant playmaking leap from Scotty Barnes, prioritizing Pascal Siakam even more in their offense. They just spent this money on Jakob Poeltl. Clearly, they're still trying to be a good basketball team. And you can say what you want about VanVleet in terms of his shooting percentages and maybe, at times a liability defensively just because he's not the biggest guy on the floor. But he was still important. He was still a former All-Star for them, and they don't really have a guard replacement for him. Like, he was playing a ton of minutes for this team last year. It's part of the reason I think his efficiency dipped, because they didn't have anybody else that could do anything remotely close to what he did for them. And this is a huge loss. Like, I know they probably didn't want to pay him $40+ million a year to bring him back. And that's why he's now in Houston, because they were willing to continue to up the price to make sure that they got their guy. And I really don't know where Toronto goes from here. Like I said, apart from really getting lucky with a couple of minimum contract or mid-level exception guards, or hoping that Scotty Barnes becomes this like point forward that he's shown flashes of, but now you don't need flashes. You need to be able to rely on that guy to do that kind of stuff. It is also worth pointing out that they brought in Dennis Schroeder shortly after the VanVleet deal was announced, and I understand that in theory is their guard replacement. Schroeder's a pretty solid player, but the drop between those two guys, obviously in terms of compensation, but in terms of overall value to your basketball team, is pretty significant. And that to me is nothing more than just like a little bit of a stopgap replacement. They needed a guard, and it's a good thing that they got another one in. But I don't think that Dennis Schroeder like solves your Fred VanVleet problem, especially as like a facilitator playmaker guy. If you're Toronto, and all of these points that I've already made about the leap they're going to need from Barnes and prioritizing the offense even more through Pascal Siakam, I think all those issues still exist, even with bringing in Schroeder. Now, you can look at it as, well, at least we brought in Schroeder on a much smaller number, and yes, that's true, but just from a basketball perspective, they definitely got worse despite bringing in Schroeder. Now, there is one more avenue to this in terms of the amount of money that he's making on how many years. So we've seen this as kind of a theme over the last couple of seasons where guys will get big contracts knowing that they're not going to finish that contract with the team that they signed it with. Because a player like VanVleet that's had a good amount of team success, of course, he wins the title. He's used to being a relevant NBA player, a guy that is relevant to winning basketball. And even though I think this helps Houston, I think Ime Udoka is going to help improve this team. They've got plenty of young talent. I don't see this as a playoff team still, because the Western Conference is just so crowded. And at some point, I think in the back of VanVleet's mind, he's thinking, I do the Houston thing for a year, maybe two, and then I end up getting traded somewhere else as they, kind of figure out, once he kind of helps develop all the other guards, those young guys are going to take over and there's not going to be as much room for him. And I think ultimately, if he finishes this contract in Houston, I'll be pretty surprised. 42 a year is a ton for him, but if it's on an expiring or it's only 2 years, there are teams around the league that certainly I think would bring in VanVleet if they're trying to make a championship push, if they need to replace a guard, maybe they get injured in the middle of the year. That's the other part of this for Houston. There are going to be people freaking out because it's a ton of money, and it is. But once the years start to shrink down a year or two from now, I think they can still get value out of VanVleet in terms of as a trade asset. I think his value as a young player mentor guy is going to be really, really obvious in Houston. And that's another benefit here. I'm actually kind of surprised how much I'm on the side of this move. I would have much rather been like $30 million a year. But again, the contract number to Houston is almost irrelevant. Like the rest of their roster is so cheap that whether VanVleet makes 45 or 28, if he's on the roster and they're at the salary cap, it really doesn't matter. And I think people are going to get caught up in the big number and it is too much, but I'm actually totally fine with the deal.